And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our March seminar in our seminar series. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. The seminar is being recorded, which means we'll be able to share it in the next few days on YouTube in both English and Spanish. All participants are muted, so please use the chat function to submit questions for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Spanish interpretation is available, as you heard. Please use the globe icon at the bottom of the screen and select English or Spanish. Next slide. For those of you who haven't joined us before, welcome. The Western Center for Ag Health and Safety at UC Davis has a mission to improve the health and safety of people working in agriculture in the West. And we do this through research, trainings, and outreach. Next slide. I'd also like to share a new website that has recently launched that's really putting our research and our activities into a digital format for farm workers, supervisors, and others working in ag. It is called Campo Seguro, and it is available in 6 languages. So we have it in English, Spanish, Punjabi, and 3 indigenous languages. We encourage you to take a look and share it with your network. Next slide. All right, so I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Tim Beatty. He is the chair of the Department of Ag Resource Economics and one of the center's core research PIs. He's going to be talking about extreme temperatures and farm worker well-being. I'll turn it over to you, Tim.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Excellent. And everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. So today we're going to be talking about extreme temperatures and farm worker well-being. This is an image that wouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this webinar. But it's one I have to put up for sort of my more indoor-focused economist colleagues, just to emphasize that working outdoors can be quite treacherous, and with the ever sort of increasing heat, can be very dangerous. Again, not a surprise to anyone on this call. Working in agriculture is risky. It is potentially the most risky industry you can work in. We've done some work that shows that, even sort of the published estimates, I think are well understood to be undercounts. So even the published estimates put agriculture at the very top of sort of the danger lists. But we think, most people think that these estimates are, significant underestimates. And so sort of the real numbers are actually much higher. Along with sort of agriculture being risky, the conditions under which the work is taking place are changing. And so I think it's safe to say that work in agriculture is getting ever more dangerous. Agricultural workers are anyone who's sort of physically active is going to be sort of disproportionately affected by heat. And so physically active workers are sort of vulnerable to, environmental conditions writ broadly, be it temperature or, in some related work, we've looked at air pollution and wildfire smoke. And so even at lower temperatures or at lower levels of exposure than folks who are not engaged in something physically active. Even at baseline rates, I mean, farm workers are about 35 times more likely to suffer from heat-related illnesses than other workers. And we know that sort of the climate is getting warmer. And so we think that sort of climate models estimate that there will be sort of 20 to 30 additional days where temperatures exceed about 90 degrees by 2050. And then most farm workers are undocumented and have limited access to the social safety net. And so even with increasing protections, here in California for farm workers, we think that there's a lot of evidence that farm workers don't take full advantage of sort of the protections that are available to them under the law, and are less likely to sort of have access to sort of the broad set of social safety net programs that might make them a little more resilient to the effects of temperature. Um, so California is the most productive agricultural state. Most of our most of the value of our of our production is in specialty crops, which is sort of labor intensive. And then there's sort of this sort of long-standing sense of a labor shortage in California. It's actually, I mean, I currently have a student working on sort of the history of kind of labor shortages in California. And, for as long as there's been agriculture in California and sort of farmers in California, there's been farmers complaining about a lack of labor in California. I mean, it is sort of you could read quotes from the 1930s that would feel very contemporary. And so sort of treating agricultural workers well and sort of protecting their safety is another way of sort of effectively having more workers, is if you can keep your workers healthy. And so, this is sort of a first order policy question. As you all know, harvest is going to happen during the hottest months. And so, essentially we see the peak of farm labor during the months in which workers would be exposed to the highest temperatures. So this talk's going to have really two related research questions. The first is, does labor respond to extreme temperatures? So do farm workers and farmers alter their behavior when temperatures are elevated? And then the second one is sort of the consequences of that, is do we observe increased injuries around days when temperatures are hot? And the answer is going to be yes to both of those questions, just if you have to hop off early. So starting with part one is, does agricultural labor respond to extreme temperatures? So what do we want to ask? We're going to look at sort of, I'm going to occasionally slip into economics jargon, and I apologize in advance. I can't help it. It's kind of who I am. So does agricultural labor adjust at the extensive margin? So here we think of, do agricultural workers show up on days in which it's hot or just stay home? And then the second question is, do they adjust labor at the intensive margin? So do they work fewer hours on days in which it's hot? We're going to try to answer questions about mechanisms. So by which I mean, do people change their behavior based on farmer behavior, or based on farmer choices, or do they change their behavior based on their own choices? And then we're going to look at sort of heterogeneity of effects across a variety of different farm conditions. And so we'll look at how do people adapt to those sorts of higher temperatures. We're going to look at sort of, do people shift time within the day? So do you start work a little earlier? Do you maybe start like later and end sort of work into the evening hours? We'll look at, do effects vary by farm size? Do large farms behave differently than small farms? So, where does this sort of research fit in? So I'm an economist. I speak to a lot of economists and a lot of agricultural economists. And the sort of critique I would make of much of the research we do is that we're really, really concerned about crops and sort of how crops respond to extreme temperatures. And so, I've sort of jokingly put up a quote, citation here to everybody and all, which is, if you look at the research on the effects of climate change on agriculture, we've learned a lot about the effects of climate change on corn in Iowa. But we know very, very little, I would say, about the effects of climate change and sort of projections about the effects of climate change on the folks who are actually working in agriculture, particularly in in sort of the United States. I mean, there is a literature that looks at the effects of climate change in developing countries, but there's very little, very little kind of large scale empirical evidence in the US. So why is that? I don't think it's because people don't care. I think it's because there's not a lot of data with which to answer these questions. And so most traditional agricultural labor surveys actually don't collect the kind of information you would need to answer these questions. The sad to see it go, the National Agricultural Workers Survey is really the gold standard. Here, it's probably how we've learned the most about agricultural workers. But for these kinds of questions where we're looking at like adaptation and we're looking at how people change their behavior, really you want to measure people at multiple points in time. And the problem with the agricultural workers survey is that it's a one-shot survey. And it's a workplace-based survey. So you show up they show up at a work site and then they interview the people who are there at the time. And so if you're really interested in sort of figuring out if there are fewer people there than normal, that's really hard to do from a survey that shows up and only talks to the people who are actually there. It doesn't actually release detailed enough information on worksite locations with which to sort of, if you want to measure the effects of environmental factors. And then just I mean, the sample sizes are relatively small. If we're trying to bring sort of statistical techniques sort of from big data frameworks, it's just not the sample sizes and the NAS just are not going to be big enough. Farm workers are a small share of the population, so alternative approaches, like using sort of US federal government surveys, which I think are not a bad way to do this, are going to turn up pretty small sample sizes. So things like the current population survey and the American Community Survey, which use dwellings as a sampling frame, are just going to end up with just not sampling large numbers of farm workers. And then we think there may be some sample selection issues that, if you've ever participated in one of these surveys, I mean, you really do have someone who shows up at your door and says, I'm from the government and I have some questions for you. You can see how folks might be sort of reluctant to participate in those sorts of surveys. And then there are, definitely significant language barriers. And so for those reasons, even the large government surveys, which are really well designed and, useful, are not going to work for these sorts of research questions. So what do we do? So we've started working with mobile phone tracking data. So this is cell phone data. So this is data that if you use a weather app, for example, on your phone, and you see an ad, in many instances, in the period we're looking at, that ad would also, because it's a weather app, it needs to know where you are. It will disclose, to the advertiser sort of some anonymized data. And some of that anonymized data includes your location, the time at which the measurement occurred, and then how fast you were moving. This data is not really designed for research purposes. It's extremely large data, so it definitely qualifies as big data, but it's what we would call an unbalanced panel. So by that I mean we see some people like a lot. We see some people not a lot, and so the data is, I would say, just very messy. And so this is definitely not the first best data, but it is data that will help us get at these really important questions. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is the data from one worker on one day in one field. And every one of those dots is essentially a a measurement. So we observe the person in the field on that day, and every one of those dots is a measurement of where that person was when they were opening the app, or whether the app sort of reported someone's location in the background. Um, we then take these sort of raw cell phone pings and we essentially map them onto there is a Land IQ for the Department of Water Resources makes available a field map of California, a field boundary map. And so what we do is we essentially take all of these cell phone pings, which are, more or less a latitude and a longitude, and we kind of put them on a map of California. And then we put another map of all of the fields in California. And then we just start to count how many of those little dots are in the fields. And, at its simplest level, that's basically what we're doing. And so on the left, you'll see those are all of the fields that Land IQ captures. And on the right, you'll see this is another example of one worker on one day in a field, actually in Yolo County here in not too far from here. So what we do is we essentially take this mobile app tracking data, we layer it onto our crop field boundaries, and then we basically get a count of how many workers are in a field on a given day. And then onto that, we layer data from university and oops. And it basically, we layer on essentially a temperature map, which gives us hourly temperature across the state in a grid pattern. And so we essentially, the right way to think about this is we're just layering this data on top of each other, and then we're going to sort of like take samples from it to measure the outcomes we're interested in. So we have to sort of define whether a device belongs to a farm worker. You could think of, if you drive from Davis to Winters, you drive through a bunch of almond fields, and we would want to exclude someone who, drives through a bunch of almond fields. They're probably not a farm worker. They're probably just someone commuting. And so we've come up with sort of a working definition of whether we would consider a device belonging to a farm worker. And so our sort of back of the envelope approach is to say, if a device is located in agricultural fields on at least 5 working days in a month, and then is moving at essentially a walking pace, we're going to count that device as belonging to a farm worker. And is this the only possible definition? Of course not. You could think of a lot of different ways to try to decide whether a device belonged to a farm worker. This is so, what I say is this is clearly ad hoc, but it's pretty reasonable. And all of our results that I'm going to show you actually we do a lot of different robustness checks. So we define farm workers in lots and lots of different ways. And all of our findings are qualitatively the same, it's kind of, we come to the same conclusions, no matter how we try to define whether a device belongs to a farm worker or not. So we get about, using this approach, we've got about 12,000 farm workers, or we identify sort of 12,000 devices belonging to farm workers. And, that's out of about a sample of about 3 million, distinct devices. And this is, roughly proportionate to agricultural workers' share of the California population. It's a little low, so we're probably undersampling farm workers. But it's in the ballpark. And so this is this every farm worker? No. Are we probably getting people who aren't farm workers? Maybe. But I'm going to show you a few figures to suggest that we are probably, that we have some reasonable degree of belief that we are capturing farm workers with this. So this is sort of, it's a pretty picture, but it's also just the picture of the share of fields in California that we capture. So the green dots in this are fields in which we do observe a worker at some point, and the yellow dots are fields in which we don't observe a worker. So you can see we have pretty good representation of the state. We tried to sort of benchmark our data against, or benchmark our sort of approach to defining farm workers against data from EDD. And what you can see is that we sort of, we do pretty well. So our data, where we sort of count people as farm workers and say, if this were shares of farm workers, how does that compare to a different measure of sort of farm workers by crop, from a different data source? And you can see that, for a lot of these, we do pretty well. We capture fruits, tree nuts, grapes, vegetables pretty well. In full disclosure, we do miss on berries, which I think is not great. Our sort of hypothesis here is that, at least from satellite data, which is how a lot of these field types are determined, other field crops and berries look pretty similar. And so, you can see that we have, we sort of overcount other field crops and undercount berries. And so, possibly some of that is due to sort of misclassification in the fields. But it is definitely, I think we do a pretty good job. Is it perfect? No. But is there other data that does it better? Unfortunately not. And so we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. So for sort of an average worker, we observe them on about 45 days. And then we observe them about 6 hours, sort of a working day of about 6 hours. And I'll explain how we sort of compute that in a minute. Mechanically, the way we count sort of the time you were at work, it just has to lead to an undercount. So we sort of look at the first time a device shows up in a field, and then we look on the same day, when was the last time that device showed up in a field? And you can see that just sort of like, you assume everyone has arrived before their phone's going to turn up in the field, and everyone leaves after their device has left the field. That just mechanically you're going to basically undercount time worked. But yeah. I promise a minimum number of equations. So essentially what we're going to look at here, so I'm going to show you some results, and we're just going to look at how does, the maximum temperature on a given day affect the probability of a worker showing up in the field. And so that's the basic regression we're going to run. And let's just get to those results. So what we see is you can look at this sort of so the way to interpret these is relative to a day where the maximum temperature is about 70 degrees. At a day in which the maximum temperature is between, let's say, 100 to 105, we would see that there's about 3 to 4% fewer workers in the field. So I would say two things about this. One is I'm pretty confident about the direction of the effects here. I think that, no matter how we slice the data, the directions are pretty are always the same. I'd just be a little careful about estimating, sort of interpreting magnitudes here. I mean, we're the first people to try to do this with this kind of data. And so I think before you really, really, really believe these results, you'll want to see other people using these kinds of data and validating them in other ways. But if you take the results sort of at face value, which again, I would take them with a grain of salt, and they're my results, we would see that, on the hottest days, so days on which the temperatures are above 105, there is a statistically significant reduction in the number of workers in the field. But the magnitudes are relatively small. That, what I sort of tell my public health friends about these magnitudes, they would like to see the sort of decline, which would be about 5%. They would like to see a much larger decline. So looking at hours worked, we also see a smaller effect, but we see about a 10% decline in hours worked on days in which the maximum temperature is above 105. So, the takeaway results here is we do see, on a really hot day, we see fewer people working in the field, and they work, and those who do work fewer hours. So, an open question, and one we're trying to shed some light on in this paper, is this driven by worker decisions, or is this driven by farmer decisions? And so, again, we're trying to draw conclusions from some, again, cell phone pings in a field. And so what we try to do is sort of layer on some additional information to try to tease out whether this is driven by farmers or farm worker decisions. And so, the first thing we look at is like start and end times. So are people more likely to work early hours on days in which the maximum temperature exceeds, a very high number? And the presumption here is that the sort of start times are determined by the farmer, not by the farm worker. Perishability of the crop. So if most specialty crops do not respond well to being in the field at high temperatures. So farmers have an incentive to keep workers in the field if they have more perishable crops, because otherwise they lose value. And so again, that's a margin of adjustment that we think is under the farmer's control rather than under the farm worker's control. And then small versus large farms. Again, if we see differences in sort of decisions between small and large farms, we think the workers might be relatively similar between those two groups. And so if the farmers are different, maybe that suggests this is also driven by farmer decisions rather than farm worker decisions. Sorry, there's more math than I promised. Okay, so what do we find? We see that for days on which the maximum temperature is above 105, farm workers are much more likely to start early in the day. So observing a farm worker before sunrise is about 5%, 4% more likely on a day in which the maximum temperature is above 105. Results for sunset are both smaller in magnitude and not statistically significant. So it doesn't look like there's a lot of adjustment sort of working into the night. Perishability. So the same idea. Do we observe more, are people more likely to stay home and not work? So it's the same basic research design, but the question is we split the sample up for perishable crops versus more perishable crops. And, we see that sort of more perishable crops, there's not a huge difference, but more perishable crops are likely to stay home more. And then we look at farm size. So you ask yourself, you just observe a bunch of fields and cell phones. How do you know how big a farm is, particularly if a farm owns multiple fields and they're discontinuous? So what we do here is we layer on data from the pesticide application permits, which have sort of a unique number identifier that's common across growers. And so we use that to link fields into sort of, farms. And then we compare farms to we compare sort of farms relative to farms for the same commodity sort of are they above the median size farm or below the median size farm? So we're not comparing, a large, we're not calling a large strawberry farm is much smaller often than like a small, turf grass farm or something, where that are much larger in acreage. So again, it's small and large is defined relative to the commodity, not so you shouldn't think of this as like comparing just acres. Uh, and so what do we find? We find as a rule that large farms are much less responsive to high temperatures. And the way we interpret this is that if you're a large farm, you have the resources to engage in adaptive behavior. Whereas if you're a small farm, your kind of only way of mitigating heat for some of your workers is simply not to operate on that day. And so, we take this as a sign that sort of large farms are able to invest in the kind of equipment that allows them to continue working on hot days. So in the time I have left, I'm just going to talk quickly through this idea. So what we see in the sort of previous finding is, people do reduce their labor supply on hot days, but not all that much. And this sort of second part of this is, how much do these elevated temperatures increase the risk of injury? And does it vary by injury type? And then we're going to just quickly at the end look at the heat illness prevention program of 2005. So the key point here is that, a lot of the sort of effects of heat, there's sort of this growing literature in economics on the effects of environmental sort of bads on cognitive function. So we know, for example, that, if air pollution's really high on a day, kids do worse on test scores, or kids' test scores are lower. If it's hot, we know there's more crime on those days. So we know there's more traffic accidents on days which there's more pollution. So there's this growing literature that says that these sort of environmental bads can have real cognitive impairment. And so, doing something that is sort of intrinsically dangerous, which is a lot of what farm workers do, if we sort of make it much harder by making it hot out, we would expect to see it just becoming ever more dangerous. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. So this is just, some quotes from the newspaper. And so the quote I want to read is like, you're already reacting more slowly. You are making different choices than you would. A lot of people become irritable at this point. You're not recognizing these are working conditions that are unusual and dangerous. And so it's not just that people suffer from heat-related injuries, it's that they sort of are more likely to suffer from other traumatic injuries in addition to increased heat-related illness. And so that's sort of what we're looking at here. We use data from the Workers' Compensation Information System. So California is sort of uniquely well suited to this. We have worked with other states, but they're either, a lot of states don't require coverage for agricultural workers. They don't require coverage for seasonal workers. Some states don't require reporting of sort of the kinds of injuries that are reportable in California. So California's workers' compensation data really is the gold standard. And when we look at, when we use the NAS to look at what share of workers are covered by these sorts of programs, we find it's about 85% of California farm workers report being covered by workers' compensation. And so, we observe about 380,000 injuries. And again, just given the nature of the data, so it's from the workers' compensation system, it's mostly traumatic injuries. So you can see here that, sort of overwhelmingly, the injuries in this data are traumatic injuries. So I'm going to show you results for sort of all injuries, but looking at this graph, you can see that most of these injuries are going to be traumatic injuries. Um, so what we see is that, as sort of the maximum temperature in a day goes up, we see basically a 10 to 15% increase in traumatic injuries. So there is a statistically significant and sort of fairly large increase in traumatic injury, sorry, in all injuries. When we break that out into traumatic injuries versus heat-related injuries, you'll notice the axes here are quite different. On the left, we have traumatic injuries. So that's, again, about a 15% increase and fairly precisely estimated. So those are given sort of the scale of the y-axis, that's actually a fairly small confidence interval. So it's very precisely estimated. There are just given the nature of the workers' compensation system, there are very few heat-related illnesses in the data. And so we don't observe that many of them, but those that we do observe, we see, for a day above 105, we observed, 450% increase in injury. So these are very different magnitudes. Clearly when it gets hot, we have many more heat-related injuries. But there just aren't that many of them in the data. So these aren't actually all that precisely estimated. And we do see there is this knock-on effect of many, many more traumatic injuries. So there's an increase in, heat stroke and other heat-related illness injuries, but there's also a significant increase in, people falling off ladders, people just making bad decisions and, having traumatic injuries as a result. So it's not just, the important takeaway here is it's not just the heat-related injuries. It's also this sort of generalized increase in traumatic injuries that occurs when it gets hot. So one thing I was unaware of before we started down this line of work is one thing to try to look at is acclimatization. So is maybe the policy angle of this is sort of newly hired workers should be treated a little differently and maybe slowly acclimatized to working at higher temperatures, and in that way you might be able to avoid maybe the worst of these sorts of injuries. And there is, a significant amount of evidence in the public health literature that sort of acclimatization can work, so that most outdoor fatalities occur in the first few days of working in warmer, hot environments, just so that folks can build up a tolerance. And so what we do, and I'll just be the first to admit this is kind of an imperfect measure, is we look at people who are within, the first 2 weeks of their hire date. Of course, this is going to mismeasure people who were just working like 2 farms over the day before. We're going to treat those people as new hires. And so that's going to sort of bias our results downwards. So this is going to be kind of a pretty noisy measure of acclimatization, but unfortunately, it's kind of the best we can do with this data. And what we see is, I think, sort of modest evidence that acclimatization, that there is sort of an increased injury risk among folks who are kind of newly hired. Again, many of our newly hired people in this data won't actually be newly hired, so that's going to bias that result towards zero. And so, if you think of this as a lower bound estimate, it does suggest that there is some acclimatization effect. These are very preliminary results, and so I think it's worth taking these with another grain of salt, which is, our data goes back far enough that we can look at kind of before and after the 2005 heat and illness prevention regulation, and just look at, how do injuries change sort of in the years before and the years after. And again, this is very preliminary, so please, interpret this with some caution. But we do sort of see, a fairly significant drop in heat-related injuries, excuse me, in the period after the regulation was adopted. And so it does, just again, based on this very early work, it does look like that program was fairly effective at reducing injuries amongst agricultural workers. Um, we do, just as a sort of aside, we do look at like a bunch of injuries that should be unrelated to heat, and we do find that we don't see really any effect on those. So these are sort of our placebo injuries. Um, we do a back of the envelope calculation, and we sort of estimate that sort of working on hot, sort of the effective temperature is roughly about 680 injuries per year more than there would otherwise be. And if we just look at sort of the cost of those injuries, we see that that's about $32 million a year. In practice, that's a really big underestimate because we really don't account for sort of pain and suffering or sort of all of the foregone wages. This is just the cost of medical treatment. So what I was hoping to sort of interest you in today is sort of there are lots of questions about sort of the agricultural workforce that are just really hard to answer because the data just isn't there. And if we want to answer these questions, we're just going to have to be we're just got to be really creative about how we try to measure things. I don't sense an enormous appetite at the federal level for investments in sort of these sorts of trying to understand this better. And so if folks are interested in this, we really are going to have to be really creative and think about how do we measure things that in ways that are not expensive, that get us interest. It's not interesting, but that get us sort of answers to really important policy questions, on a budget. Unfortunately, sort of what is not measured often is just not counted. And so I think it is sort of imperative that we measure these things, even if we can't measure them perfectly. Um, so, just sort of takeaway messages. We do find that big data approaches can tell us something. Again, these are like, this is the first time anyone's tried to do this. So anytime anyone does something for the first time, you should say, well, that's interesting. It'd be great when, the third, fourth, and fifth studies come along and confirm it. So again, I want you to be very cautious about interpreting these results. That's just good science. But I think the takeaway that extreme temperatures lead to many more traumatic injuries, and then that we do observe that we can use sort of cell phone data and mobility data to try to measure the activities of farm workers in ways is really promising. And we are working with providers of this data to try to keep working on these sorts of problems because I think they are sort of a way forward. With that, I'll just say thank you and happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I think it's such important data and perspective. I think one of the pieces that you summarized at the end that was a good reminder for me is not only is heat illness in and of itself a risk and has negative outcomes, but the heat can lead to other injuries that are also quite traumatic in and of themselves. And so that increased risk is important to call out.
Yeah, there's all this evidence on like tests, like test scores, for example. Like we just know that if kids are taking tests on like really hot days, they just do a little worse. And that's bad, but like it doesn't typically lead to traumatic injury, right? So like if you it's not an intrinsically dangerous thing to take a test. And so if you're engaging in sort of intrinsically dangerous activities, which much of farm work is, making it harder by doing it while it's really hot, or in other work doing it while there's like a lot of smoke in the air, is just it seems plausible that that's going to just increase the risk of those injuries. And so I think that's what we find.
Yeah. So folks, please feel free to put questions into the chat. I'm going to ask a couple that came up as I was thinking about it. One was if you could go back and remind what you don't have to go back with your slides, but could you remind me of the differences between large and small operations that you the assumptions that you made about those and what you expect to see?
So, so again, we're really, trying to make the most of the data we have. And so what we do is we basically, again, if you just think of this like layer cake of data, what we do is we just put another layer of data on top of it. And that layer is these pesticide application permits. And so if you apply pesticides in California, you need to get a permit. And each of the permits essentially has a unique grower ID. And those grower IDs are common across fields. And so what we do is we essentially can link fields across, a lot of farmers operate discontinuous fields. And so we want to sort of get a sense of, is this like a large grower or a small grower? And so what we do is like for every crop type, we say, are you larger than the average grower or actually the median grower or lower, smaller than the median grower? And we just split our sample into two. And so again, we're comparing in this sense, like a large strawberry farmer to a small strawberry farmer. And the idea is large farmers have access to resources typically that small farmers do not. And so, you can put in place protections against heat. So, for example, you can start workers earlier. So I didn't show it, but we have results that show that large farmers are much more likely to start workers earlier. That has folks working in the dark. How are they working in the dark? They have lights. How do they have lights? They have the money to buy the lights. And so, our interpretation of those results, and I mean, I'm open to other interpretations, of course, is that large operations have the ability to, invest in capital to mitigate sort of the effects of heat more easily than small operations, because small operations, just have fewer resources typically. And so
Does
that's
that
how
allow you, yeah, does that data allow you to account for farm labor contractors who might be operating on either large or small operations?
it does not. So we're really just comparing big to small sort
Yeah,
of pesticide applicators. So no, we can't really tell if it's an FLC or not.
yeah.
We're doing some related work on sort of repeating, again, using this style of data, trying to get a sense of how mobile farm workers are. And we were really excited about it. And then we just managed to reproduce essentially what the NAS finds, which is that farm workers are far less mobile than they used to be. And it made me again sort of more confident in this data, because we really didn't. I mean, if you define interesting results as new results, we didn't find anything particularly interesting. We just sort of found that the data, what you find in the NAS, which is that farm workers don't commute that far, is exactly what you find in this cell phone data. Is that most of these people who we call farm workers, again, devices belonging to someone who shows up in a field, are don't move around as much, like are pretty don't move around a lot.
Right. They're
So
settled. So one thing that comes to mind, you are working, as you said, with big data. Um, what are questions that would help you in your sort of assumption building and so forth that could come from closer to community level, whether they're from like farmers and operators or from farm workers and community folks about whether these assumptions are good, not good, what additional factors should be considered? Are there any sort of small data pieces that you wish you had?
um, I would say let me spin that and say I would love to have this like sort of collection of this kind of data, collection of the small data at scale. And so the ability to, something we've been kind of talking about, is um, so you can, so let me back up. I am just an intrinsically like big data person. I think you sort of get these sort of patterns and can detect effects it's just very hard to do with precision and I think, I'm not, it's sort of just my background. Uh, so the sort of approach, one of the approaches we're thinking of at the moment is sort of large scale survey approaches. So most of these folks are on their phone. They belong to social networks. And it turns out with sort of you know a lot of these sort of large social network companies are very invested in sort of new AI tools to to basically so that they can, I mean, this data exists so you can advertise to people. Those very same platforms can be used to like target ads to complete surveys, for example. So one of the sort of ideas I've been trying to operationalize unsuccessfully to date, but if anyone is interested, let me know, is you can do targeted surveys. So you can buy ads on Facebook for people who fit, or Instagram or any of these large social media platforms for people who fit very specific demographics. Um, and you can do it for geographies. And so one of our thoughts is about doing essentially sort of trying to what you described as take what you described as small data and actually do a big data version of it, which is buy ads that are directly targeted against that demographic and profession and group, and see if we can't run surveys against that and sort of validate our data, which is like, we think this sort of, it would be a way of sort of saying, we think this, um, person is a farm worker, and we could then put an ad in front of them, based on the platform's algorithm. And we think the cost of completion would be pretty modest, but that's just something we're thinking about.
Yeah, well, I know I can tell from our attendee list that there are people who work in community settings with farm workers and probably could help think through how that
That
might
would be
work,
amazing.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, I think it's for better for worse. I think it requires, it takes a village. I mean, I think sort of both. I think it takes an evidentiary village as well, right? I mean, I don't think there's any one magic approach to this. I think we need stories. We need interview sort of qualitative data. And then I also think we do need this for better or for worse, I do think sort of large scale empirical data does have a cachet and is an important part of every evidence portfolio. So it's, again, no one should believe any one study. No one should believe any one kind of data. And so it's only when there's a kind of balance of the evidence from a lot of different sources that we really have a complete story.
I love that. And I think I'm going to have that be our final word. I think that that speaks to the approach that the Western Center tries to take, different methods and ways of asking and answering questions, and recognizing that we want to work with everyone in agriculture. So I see a wide range of people who are attending today. If this is a topic that's of interest to you, please reach out. We'd be happy to talk with you more. And I'm going to invite all of you to join us for the April seminar, which is going to be with someone from the California Department of Public Health talking about valley fever. We know that cases are increasing. We know it affects the agricultural workforce, and we hope that you will join us next month for that seminar. Thank you so much, Dr. Beatty. We really appreciate your time, and we will talk soon. Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.